I'd like to read you a short story from my new book, Small Lights Burning. It's a book of poetry and short stories, and here's a short story about a little boy called George. It's called Locked Inside. George was locked inside his own head. He couldn't get out. More accurately, he didn't want to get out. It wasn't like a prison cell or something like that. It was quite comfortable. He was always locked inside his own head. The inside of his head, you see, felt safe and secure. Everything inside his head was familiar. Outside his head, the world looked scary and felt unpredictable. Closing his eyes, he was able to see all sorts of things that others couldn't inside his head. And so George sat there all alone, with his own thoughts, playing games inside his own mind. He never played with the other children. Even when they invited him, he was comfortable on his own, free to be himself, locked up, safe and secure, inside his own mind. Inside George's head, everything and anything was possible. There was no one to tell him what to do, and no one could make him feel sad. The other children looked at George and were curious. They tried to talk to him, but George said nothing. He wouldn't even look at them. They tried to get him to play games with them, but George just sat there staring ahead. Some of them called him names and made fun of him. They didn't understand why he was so different. In the end, all the other children got bored with George. Then they called him a few more names, and then they ran away laughing. They left George alone, locked inside his own head. George was always alone with his own thoughts. And then one day, George began to wonder what it might be like to escape from inside his own head. He imagined what it would be like to unlock the door in his mind and go outside. But he couldn't. It was scary outside his head, and he began to get quite anxious about leaving his safe place. So he stayed locked up inside. All around him, the children played and laughed and danced and ran. And George just sat there staring ahead, locked inside his own head. Until one day, Maisie came along. As she walked by, she stopped, gazed at him and wondered what George was thinking. But George just sat there staring ahead as usual. He didn't acknowledge her. It seemed as though he didn't even know she was there staring right at him. So Maisie walked over to take a closer look. She gently touched his hand. George looked down, and then he looked at her, and their eyes met. She has a nice face, he thought. George felt a smile slowly beginning to form on his face, and then that smile widened into a grin. And suddenly the lock in the door inside his head began to turn. It opened and the light streamed in, and George didn't feel unsafe anymore. In fact, he felt quite happy. His smile began to widen even more, and then a sound came out. It was a chuckle. George couldn't sit alone anymore. He jumped up, and soon he and Maisie were running around, laughing and shouting and playing together. As they ran between the trees and through the long grass together, George thought, "This is fun." Maisie agreed, and her tail wagged with joy.